They erased her from history, but her ghost still speaks. History is written by the victors, they say. But what happens to those voices that were deliberately silenced? What happens when powerful forces try to erase someone so completely that even their name becomes forbidden to speak? Today, I want to tell you about a woman whose story was buried so deep that for centuries, she existed only as whispers in the dark corners of libraries and hushed conversations between scholars. A woman whose very existence challenged the foundations of her time, and whose ideas were so dangerous that they tried to make her disappear entirely. But the dead, as they say, have their own ways of speaking. Her name was Hypatia of Alexandria, and she lived in the 4th century AD. But this isn't just about one woman. This is about a pattern that has repeated throughout history: the systematic erasure of women who dared to think, to teach, to challenge the status quo. Hypatia was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher. She was the head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, teaching students who came from across the known world to learn from her. She invented the astrolabe, created detailed star charts, and her mathematical work influenced scholars for generations. She was, by all accounts, one of the most brilliant minds of her era. But she lived in a time when Christianity was rising to power, and when women who wielded intellectual authority were seen as threats to the natural order. In 415 AD, a Christian mob dragged her from her chariot, stripped her naked, and brutally murdered her with pottery shards and roof tiles. They burned her body and scattered her remains. It wasn't just murder, it was an attempt at complete annihilation. And for the most part, it worked. For over 1,000 years, Hypatia's name was rarely spoken. Her works were lost, destroyed, or attributed to others. The Library of Alexandria, where she had taught and studied, was gradually dismantled. The very place where human knowledge had once flourished became a symbol of what we lose when ignorance triumphs over learning. But here's the thing about truth: it has a way of surviving, even when it's buried under centuries of silence. In the 1600s, scholars began finding fragments. A mention here, a reference there. Ancient letters that survived in monastery libraries. Slowly, piece by piece, they began to reconstruct not just her story, but the stories of dozens of other women like her. Women like Christine de Pizan, who wrote the first feminist texts in medieval Europe, only to have her works dismissed as curiosities for centuries. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, whose medical and scientific texts were attributed to male contemporaries. Women like Trotula of Salerno, whose medical school was erased from history books, making it seem like medicine was always a male profession. The pattern is always the same. First, they attack the woman herself, questioning her morality, her femininity, her right to speak. Then they attack her work, claiming it's not original, that she must have stolen it from a man, that it's not really important anyway. Finally, they erase her entirely, removing her name from records, destroying her works, making it as if she never existed at all. But ghosts have a way of coming back. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as archaeological methods improved, as more manuscripts were discovered, as scholars began to ask different questions about the past, these women started to emerge from the shadows. Not as the monsters or anomalies their enemies had painted them as, but as complex, brilliant human beings who had contributed immeasurably to human knowledge and progress. We discovered that women had been astronomers in ancient Babylon, mathematicians in medieval Islam, physicians in ancient Greece, philosophers in Renaissance Italy. They had always been there, but their stories had been systematically suppressed. Hypatia's ghost speaks to us through the fragments that survive, through the students who remembered her teachings, through the astronomical calculations that bear her invisible signature, through the very fact that her enemies felt she was dangerous enough to kill. And she's not alone. The archives are full of ghosts like her. Women whose patents were filed under their husbands' names. Women whose discoveries were credited to male colleagues. Women whose very existence challenges the narrative that genius and achievement have always been primarily masculine domains. Today, we're still uncovering these stories. DNA analysis is revealing female Viking warriors who were previously assumed to be men. Archaeological evidence is showing that women in ancient civilizations held far more power and authority than traditional histories suggested. Digital humanities projects are using computer analysis to identify anonymous works that were likely written by women. Every new discovery is like hearing another ghost speak. Another voice that was silenced but refused to stay quiet forever. But this isn't just about the past. The same patterns of erasure continue today. Women's contributions to science, technology, politics, and culture are still being minimized, overlooked, or forgotten. The mechanisms may be more subtle now, but the effect is the same. The difference is that now we know what to look for. We recognize the patterns. We understand how erasure works, and we're actively fighting against it. Hypatia's ghost reminds us that truth is persistent, that knowledge, once created, wants to survive, that brilliant minds leave traces that no amount of violence or suppression can completely destroy. Her story teaches us to look for the missing voices in every historical narrative, to ask who isn't represented, to dig deeper when something seems too convenient or too uniform. Most importantly, it reminds us that when we hear whispers of forgotten women, when we find fragments of suppressed stories, we have a responsibility to amplify them. To make sure that this time, the voices that were meant to be silenced are finally heard. The dead may not be able to speak for themselves, but we can speak for them. We can make sure their ghosts become flesh and blood again, that their stories become part of the record, that their contributions are acknowledged and celebrated. History tried to erase Hypatia, but she's more famous now than she ever was in her lifetime. Her ghost didn't just survive, it grew stronger with time. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful form of haunting of all. The kind where the truth refuses to stay buried, no matter how deep they dig the grave. The ghosts of history are speaking. The question is, are we finally ready to listen?